Minecraft has been around for over a decade, and over the years has completely transformed several times to the point where it's almost unrecognizable as the same game today. That's why I've taken it upon myself to take you back in time and explore every version of Minecraft that has ever been released. I want to see how the world of Minecraft evolved from a simple sandbox game about building with blocks to a world sprawling with life in which you must fight for survival, explore sprawling caves and giant mountains, protect villages from raids, and adventure into unknown parallel worlds. So join me as we dig through time and uncover the history of Minecraft's development block by block. Before it became the behemoth it is today, Minecraft actually began its conception in a very different light. While most of the block-by-block series is going to be based on specific builds of Minecraft itself, I thought it was important to address where exactly the idea behind Minecraft actually came from. If you're not too familiar with the origins of Minecraft, then you might assume Minecraft was inspired by other sandbox games like Garry's Mod, or even real-world toys like Lego. It seemed like a reasonable assumption. Minecraft is about bringing your imagination to life by placing blocks on top of blocks. You can build houses, castles, cities, or let your imagination really go wild and completely transform your world into something truly surreal. If that's what you thought, you might be surprised to find out that the beginning of Minecraft's development can actually be traced back to this. This is a cult classic roguelike title called Dwarf Fortress, designed around using procedural generation to create not just randomly generated environments like in Minecraft, but dynamically simulates the development of entire cultures down to individual characters and their personal stories to create consistent lore throughout. The game has been in development for around 20 years and is still in alpha state, due to its extremely ambitious development. I'm not personally too familiar with Dwarf Fortress, but from what I can tell, this game is extremely complex under the hood and has a lot going on. Dwarf Fortress itself seems to have an interesting development history, but I won't dig that far in this video as it has little to do with Minecraft. The important part to note is the general design of Dwarf Fortress. The player is put in control of managing a colony of dwarves and help them to survive and develop their civilization however you want. Think something like Roller Coaster Tycoon, just instead of roller coasters you're helping these things stay alive. There is no core objective, no win condition. Your goal is whatever you want it to be, but the game only ends when the last dwarf dies. You can probably tell just by looking at this gameplay that this game isn't even remotely considered user-friendly. Granted, over the years the game has gotten a lot more user-friendly, at least from what I can tell at a surface-level glance at its page on Steam, but back in 2009, this was certainly not the case, and the developers didn't seem to show any interest in making it so. Enter Markus Persson, aka Notch. If you're a fan of Minecraft, you've most certainly heard this man's name time and time again. For better or worse. While he's since gone down a pretty strange and concerning path, at the time, Notch was a humble game developer who also happened to be a fan of Dwarf Fortress. Notch had been working on a variety of projects using Java that never saw the light of day. The most prominent of these was a game called Rubylands, which would have been a resource management game in which the player would hire and prep heroes to go out and complete quests. Alongside Rubylands are some other projects, including Ruby, a generic JRPG title that sounds similar in vein to Dragon Quest or Final Fantasy, Rubylands X, which would have been a roguelike that seems to be designed around the use of magic, explosive chains, and fancy lighting effects, and Rubyland, singular because I guess only one of them looks like this, which would have been a first-person tile-based dungeon crawler. Some interesting points to note with some of these projects are some of the features noted. Rubylands X features exploding barrel chain reactions, and Rubyland featured per-tile brightness and an animated fire texture. It's quite possible these ideas would live on as features in Minecraft. TNT, block-based lighting, and fire. The HUD of Rubyland even bears a strong resemblance to Minecraft's, but there's another step to talk about there in a future video. Beyond what little has been shared about these games, including a few screenshots you've been looking at, we don't know much about these projects at all because they never saw the light of day. In 2009, Notch seemed to take an interest in the concept of Dwarf Fortress and decided to add yet another title to his collection of Ruby-related projects. This project would come to be known as Ruby Dung. That's short for Rubylands and Dungeon, a name that couldn't possibly be misconstrued to mean anything else. The Rubylands was meant to be a world in which all these projects would take place, implying that they were at least loosely related to each other. Like the other Rubylands games, Ruby-Dung was ultimately dropped pretty early in development, but to say it never saw the light of day isn't quite accurate. Sure, Ruby-Dung itself was never released, but its source code would later be used to form the basis of what would later become Minecraft. The idea for Ruby-Dung was to be a clone of Dwarf Fortress with a more user-friendly environment. Unlike Dwarf Fortress's text-based graphics, Ruby-Dung had graphics rendered in a 3D isometric view. We know that at one point, Notch wanted the game to be able to switch between his isometric view and the first-person view similar to Rubyland, but he was dissatisfied with the way the game's textures looked up close. This is a bit ironic considering when you look closer, you'll notice the grass and stone textures are the same as would later be used in Minecraft. In fact, Ruby-Dung even used the exact same image, terrain.png, that Minecraft would go on to use for its entire development cycle, and even many updates after release. So, what changed? Well, the more commonly known root of inspiration for Minecraft comes from a game called Infiniminer. This game was a multiplayer game in which miners would search for minerals by digging through a rather familiar-looking block-based procedurally generated world. It was this block-based aesthetic that finally connected the dots for Notch. What you are looking at here is the earliest known footage of Minecraft, built on top of the source code of Ruby-Dung, even using letters RD in its name, rd131655. The game was now reimagined as a block-based sandbox game about building and digging through simple blocks. At this point in development, the game was simply given the generic name of Cave Game, and featured a similar procedurally generated world to that of Infiniminer. This version of Minecraft featured only two distinct blocks, grass and stone, both of which reused textures from Ruby-Dung. Chunks were loaded in 16x16 blocks because splitting the world into smaller chunks would decrease performance. The entire game world was only 256x64x256. Even though the game was planned around the idea of building and placing blocks, the build focused exclusively on the exploration aspect. Caves generating in the ground would cut all the way down to the bottom of the world, and if you fell through the bottom or walked off the side of it, you'd end up falling infinitely into the void. The game doesn't have a death mechanic yet, but you can respawn by pressing R. Lighting in this game is very simple. Block faces are simply either light or dark, with sunlight hitting the topmost block in each column, and cast a shadow on all exposed block faces directly beneath. This lighting system would later be reworked, but the way it's implemented here causes dark areas to be really difficult to see. And, well, that's pretty much it. There's some other of Notch's projects that I'd like to briefly talk about, but they relate to features that we'll be discussing later on in the series. I'd like to stress once again that this is one of my first serious attempts at actually starting a YouTube channel. So if you enjoyed this content, I'd really appreciate it if you could like this video to help me get things up and going, and please subscribe to see more like it. I'd also like to stress that this is not going to be the format for this entire series. This video is more of a prelude to set the foundation of what the development of Minecraft looked like at the time it was starting to take shape. While future videos might have a brief introduction in a similar format to this to cover information from other inaccessible versions like rd131655, most videos will be in more of a traditional Let's Play format, in which we'll be exploring specific versions hands-on. The first update we'll be playing next time is rd132211, which is the earliest available version through the Minecraft launcher. This version allows players to actually place and destroy blocks. Most builds are limited to just stone, however, as the block you place is determined by its position, and anything above or below the surface is automatically stone. With that in mind, if you have any ideas for builds in the future, please feel free to share them in the comments and I'll try to build my favorites in future videos. Thank you so much for watching this video to the end, and I'll see you in the next one.